The most dangerous drought threat in the United States is not just dry weather, it is a slow, widening crisis of heat, snow loss, shrinking runoff, and disappearing water reserves across the West. What begins in the mountains reaches reservoirs, farms, cities, forests, and even groundwater deep below the surface. This drought is not a single season, it is a system under pressure. In this video, the worst drought threat facing the U.S. right now, the deeper mechanism is revealed. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow for more calm, deeply researched documentaries. Across the United States, the pattern of dryness spreads in uneven shapes that shift with season and terrain. In the present view, the broadest and most persistent area of concern lies across the western interior, where mountains, basins, and plateaus form a connected region of limited moisture. The land here is not uniformly dry, yet the signal of drought is clear when observed over time. Soil moisture runs below average across wide areas. Rivers carry less water than expected for the season, and reservoirs sit lower than their long-term levels. The pattern does not begin at the ground alone. It reflects a combination of atmospheric conditions, seasonal cycles, and long-term warming trends that together shape how water arrives, how it is stored, and how it is lost. The western United States includes the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, the Rocky Mountains, and the basins that lie between and beyond them. These features guide the movement of air and water. Moisture that travels inland from the Pacific Ocean often meets these mountain ranges first. When storms are strong and frequent, they deposit rain and snow that build a reserve for the months ahead. When storms are fewer or weaker, the reserve remains thin. Observations over recent years indicate that the western region experiences recurring periods in which precipitation falls short of the historical average, and temperatures remain higher than the baseline that guided earlier water systems. Temperature plays a quiet but decisive role in this pattern. Warmer air can hold more water vapor, which increases what scientists call evaporative demand, the tendency of the atmosphere to draw moisture from surfaces. This demand does not create water. It removes it from soil, vegetation, and open water when conditions allow. Even in years when total precipitation is near average, higher temperatures can reduce the effective water available to ecosystems and human use. Measurements from ground stations and satellite instruments show that large parts of the West have warmed over the past decades. The increase is not uniform in space or time, yet the overall direction is clear enough to influence water balance across the region. Within this broad field, drought does not appear as a single event with a sharp beginning and end. It develops gradually and often overlaps with earlier dry periods. Scientists distinguish between short-term drought, which may affect soil moisture and crops within a season, and long-term drought, which affects groundwater, reservoirs, and ecosystems over years. The western United States has experienced both forms, with episodes that extend across multiple years. Tree ring records, which provide a long view of past climate, indicate that periods of extended dryness have occurred before. What differs now is the added influence of sustained warmth, which intensifies the effects of reduced precipitation. The continental pattern also shows contrast between regions. While the West holds the most persistent signal of drought risk, other areas of the United States experience their own variations. Parts of the Great Plains may shift between wet and dry phases as atmospheric circulation changes. The eastern United States generally receives more consistent precipitation, yet it is not immune to dry spells. In the present frame, however, the western interior stands out for the combination of low precipitation, high temperature, and strong dependence on seasonal water storage. This combination creates a vulnerability that is both broad in extent and deep in its effects. The scale of observation matters. At a national scale, drought appears as a set of coloured regions on a map, each representing a level of dryness based on soil moisture, precipitation, and stream flow. At a regional scale, these colours resolve into patterns that follow mountain ranges and river basins. At a local scale, the pattern becomes a set of tangible signs: dry ground, reduced stream levels, stressed vegetation. Each scale reveals part of the same process. Moving from a wide overview to a closer view of how water moves through land and air, the Western drought pattern is closely tied to the Colorado River Basin, a large drainage area that spans several states and supports millions of people, as well as extensive agriculture. The basin collects water from snow and rain that fall in its headwaters and carries it through a network of rivers and reservoirs. When the basin receives less input and loses more water to evaporation and use, its balance shifts toward shortage. This imbalance does not remain confined to the basin. It influences water availability across cities, farms, and ecosystems that depend on its flow. At the same time, uncertainty remains in the exact distribution and timing of drought within the region. Observations indicate clear trends in temperature and changes in precipitation patterns, yet the year-to-year variability of weather continues to play a strong role. Some seasons bring relief in the form of heavier storms or cooler conditions. These periods can reduce the immediate intensity of drought, but may not fully restore long-term water reserves. It remains uncertain how sequences of wet and dry years will align in the future, though the underlying trend of warming suggests that recovery periods may become less effective at rebuilding lost storage. The continental dryness pattern, therefore, serves as the outer frame of a more detailed process. It shows where the stress is most visible and where the balance of water is most fragile. From this broad perspective, the western United States stands as the central region of concern, defined by its climate, its terrain, and its reliance on seasonal storage of water. The pattern does not act alone. It connects to the behavior of the atmosphere above and the land below, forming a system in which each part influences the others. Within this system, the current drought threat is not a single phenomenon but a layered condition. It reflects the interaction of weather patterns, long-term climate trends, and human use of water. Each layer contributes to the overall state of dryness, and each layer can be observed and measured in different ways. By beginning with the continental view, the pattern becomes clear as a starting point, a surface expression of deeper processes that extend from the sky to the ground and beyond. The land remains still under this pattern, yet the processes that shape it are in constant motion. Air moves, temperatures rise and fall, moisture shifts between forms. Over time, these movements accumulate into the dryness that defines the region. The Western drought, in this sense, is both a present condition and a continuation of processes that have been unfolding over years. It is observed, measured, and described, forming the outermost layer of a complex system that extends inward through the environment. Above the dry ground of the western United States, the air forms a broad envelope of warmth that influences nearly every part of the water cycle. This layer is not visible in the way a river or reservoir is visible, yet its effects are measurable in temperature records, satellite observations, and the changing condition of land below. Warm air alters how quickly moisture leaves soil, vegetation, and open water. It changes the balance between what falls from the sky and what remains on the land. In the present drought threat, this warm atmospheric layer is one of the most important outer controls. Air can hold water vapor, the gas form of water, and the amount it can hold increases as temperature rises. This physical rule shapes drought in a direct way. When air becomes warmer, its capacity to contain moisture grows. If the added moisture is not supplied by clouds, rain, soil, or plants, the air remains unsatisfied and continues to draw water upward from the surface. Scientists describe this pull as evaporative demand. It is a useful term because it separates the desire of the atmosphere for water from the actual supply available at the ground. In a hot, dry, and windy setting, evaporative demand rises. In a cool, humid setting, it falls. The western United States now experiences longer and more frequent periods in which this atmospheric demand remains high. This warming envelope does not sit evenly over the region at all times. It expands and contracts with seasons, weather patterns, and elevation. During the hotter months, strong sunlight heats exposed land surfaces, especially in deserts and dry basins where little moisture is available to moderate temperature. The ground then warms the air directly above it. In mountain regions, the process differs in detail but leads to a similar effect when warm periods persist. High terrain that once held colder air for longer parts of the year now spends more time above freezing. This shift changes the character of the air over wide areas, especially during late winter and spring. The effect on moisture is gradual but relentless. Soil loses water to evaporation, which is the direct change of liquid water into vapor. Plants lose water through tiny openings in their leaves, a process called transpiration. Together, these losses are often treated as one combined process because both move water from land to air. Under warm conditions, this combined loss grows. A patch of ground that might once have retained some moisture through a mild spring can dry more quickly when air temperatures remain high. A stand of grass or shrubs may use water earlier in the season, leaving less available as summer advances. Even reservoirs lose more water from their surfaces when warmth, dry air, and wind act together. Heat also affects the atmosphere itself in ways that reinforce dryness near the surface. Warm air tends to rise when heated from below, but large-scale patterns can also produce sinking air over broad regions. When air sinks, it compresses and warms. As it warms, its relative humidity drops, meaning it becomes drier compared with the amount of moisture it could hold at that temperature. This process can suppress cloud formation and reduce the chance of rainfall. In the western United States, periods of stable high pressure often bring clear skies, strong sun, and continued warming at the surface. Under these conditions, day after day of heat can build into a persistent drying force. Relative humidity is a measure of how full the air is with moisture compared with its total capacity. It is important because the atmosphere does not respond only to temperature. It responds to the combination of heat and moisture already present. Warm air with low relative humidity has a strong ability to draw water from the ground. This is why drought can intensify even without a complete absence of rain. A region may receive some precipitation, yet still grow drier if the warmth between storms extracts water faster than new moisture arrives. Observations across the West show that this balance has shifted in many areas toward greater loss. The warming envelope is also linked to the length of hot spells. A single hot day can dry the surface slightly, but a sequence of hot weeks produces a more serious change. Surface moisture declines first, then shallow soils dry. Plants begin to reduce growth or close their leaf openings to conserve water. This can limit transpiration for a time, but it also places stress on vegetation. Once the upper soil layers are depleted, recovery becomes harder unless substantial precipitation arrives. Heat waves therefore act as concentrated periods within the broader drought pattern, sharpening its effects and extending them deeper into the landscape. Nighttime warmth matters as well. When nights remain warmer than average, the land and vegetation gain less relief from daytime heat. Water loss continues at a higher pace, and snow in colder regions can soften or melt more readily. Historically, cool nights have often helped maintain seasonal moisture and delayed spring drying. As average temperatures rise, that buffering effect weakens. The atmosphere remains more active as an agent of drying over a greater share of the daily cycle. Not all uncertainty is removed from this picture. Observations clearly show rising temperatures across much of the western United States, and measurements indicate that atmospheric drying power has increased in many places. It remains uncertain exactly how this increase will combine with year-to-year shifts in storms, cloud cover, and regional wind patterns in every basin and season. Some areas may experience temporary relief during cooler or wetter intervals. Even so, the larger scientific understanding is consistent. Warmer air raises evaporative demand, and higher evaporative demand intensifies drought when water supplies are limited. The importance of this atmospheric layer lies in its reach. It acts across deserts, valleys, grasslands, forests, and mountain slopes. It does not depend on any single river or reservoir. Instead, it shapes the background condition in which all surface water must exist. Rain that falls into warm, thirsty air may not remain long at the surface. Soil moisture that gathers in winter may disappear sooner in spring. Snow, if it forms, may face more frequent warm spells that alter how long it remains stored. Within the western drought threat, this heat envelope is therefore more than a symptom. It is a controlling condition that changes how every later process behaves. The land beneath it becomes more exposed to drying, not only because less moisture may arrive, but because the atmosphere now asks for more. That persistent request, expressed through heat, low humidity, and prolonged warmth, turns ordinary dry periods into more severe ones. The outer air over the region becomes an active part of the drought itself, surrounding the landscape with a steady pressure toward loss. Within the warm envelope that covers the western United States, the movement of storms forms the next layer of the drought story. Far above the ground, air currents flow around the hemisphere in broad paths that guide clouds, rain, and snow. These currents do not move in straight lines. They bend, dip, and arch in response to the contrast between warm and cold regions, the rotation of Earth, and the distribution of pressure in the atmosphere. In the middle latitudes, where the western United States lies, these upper paths often act as the roads followed by winter storms. When the roads shift away, weaken, or break into less favourable patterns, the land below receives less moisture than it needs. The most important of these currents is the jet stream, a fast-moving ribbon of air high in the atmosphere. It forms where strong temperature differences exist between large air masses. In North America, the jet stream often helps steer storms from the Pacific Ocean toward the continent during the cool season. This matters deeply to the western United States because much of its annual water supply arrives in late autumn, winter, and early spring. A dry winter is not simply a season with fewer cloudy days. It is a season in which the main delivery system of moisture fails to pass overhead often enough, or fails to arrive with enough strength. Storm tracks vary from year to year. In some winters they angle toward the Pacific Northwest, bringing repeated fronts and mountain snow. In others they dip farther south, feeding California and the desert southwest. Some years produce a sequence of powerful river-like corridors of moisture from the Pacific, often called atmospheric rivers. These events can bring intense rain to coasts and heavy snow to mountains when temperatures are low enough. In other years, such corridors are rare, weak, or directed elsewhere. The drought threat grows when storm paths spend too much time displaced from the basins and ranges that depend on them. High-pressure systems play a large part in this displacement. A high-pressure system is a broad region where air tends to sink. Sinking air discourages cloud growth and often leads to calmer, clearer weather. When a high-pressure pattern becomes strong and persistent over the eastern Pacific Ocean or the western part of the continent, it can divert incoming storms northward or split them before they move inland. The land beneath such a pattern may remain dry for weeks, under winter conditions. This means missed opportunities for snow accumulation. Under warmer conditions, it also means continued sunshine and greater surface drying. The effect of these shifts becomes clear when viewed over an entire season. A single missed storm rarely defines a drought. The western United States has always experienced intervals between storms. What matters is the repeated absence of moisture-bearing systems across a large region. When one storm after another tracks around the key mountain ranges, the seasonal total falls behind. Snowpack remains thin, soils are not fully wetted, small streams receive little recharge. The atmosphere above the region may still be active, but its activity is arranged in a way that leaves the surface short of water. Ocean conditions can influence this arrangement, though not with perfect predictability. Variations in tropical Pacific Ocean temperatures, including the patterns known as El Niño and La Niña, are associated with shifts in the position and strength of storm tracks over North America. These patterns can tilt the odds toward wetter or drier winters in particular regions, yet the relationship is not exact for every year or every basin. Observations indicate that some La Niña winters favor drier conditions across the southern part of the West, while some El Niño winters enhance storm activity farther south. It remains uncertain how any single ocean pattern will combine with other atmospheric features in a given season. The connection is useful, but it is not mechanical. What can be observed more directly is the outcome in accumulated precipitation. Mountain snow gauges, radar, satellite measurements, and weather stations show where storms pass and where they do not. In drought years, maps of precipitation anomaly reveal deficits extending across parts of California, the Great Basin, the Southwest, and the Central or Southern Rockies. The deficits may begin early in the cool season, when the first substantial storms arrive late. They may deepen in midwinter. When long dry intervals appear between fronts, they may continue into spring, when the chance to rebuild seasonal storage grows short. By then, the mist water cannot easily be replaced. The timing of these storm paths is as important as their total number. A wet spell in late spring may help surface vegetation, yet it cannot fully replace snow that failed to accumulate during colder months. Rain falling after the main cold season behaves differently from snow that settles into a mountain pack and waits to melt. This is why storm track changes are not simply about whether moisture arrives, but when and how it arrives. A storm that reaches the mountains during a warm period may deliver rain instead of snow, and the water may move quickly downslope rather than staying in storage. The path aloft and the warmth of the air below work together to determine the result. There is also a matter of scale. A storm track may appear favourable at the continental level while still leaving individual basins dry. One mountain range can receive repeated snowfall, while another nearby remains below normal. Valleys in the rain shadow of higher terrain may stay dry even during otherwise active periods. These local differences matter for water management and ecology. Still, the larger drought threat emerges when many of these local deficits align across a wide area. creating a regional shortfall that extends from slopes to streams and from headwaters to reservoirs. Scientists continue to study how climate warming may influence the behavior of storm tracks over time. Some evidence suggests that warming can alter the distribution of pressure, the contrast between ocean and land, and the characteristics of individual storms. It remains uncertain how these factors will reshape the precise paths of winter storms in each part of the West over the long term. Even without complete certainty on every mechanism, observations already show the practical result of unfavourable storm patterns. When the tracks shift away often enough, the region enters the cool season with hope and leaves it with a deficit. In this layer of the drought process, the key fact is simple. The western United States depends on repeated passages of moisture-bearing storms during the colder part of the year. These storms are guided by atmospheric paths far above the surface. When those paths bend elsewhere, stall or weaken in useful places, the land below grows drier not through sudden loss but through repeated emission. The sky remains open, the mountains receive less snow, and the long seasonal accounting of water begins to fall behind. In that quiet absence of passing storms, the drought deepens across the region. High above the basins and valleys of the western United States, the mountain snow zone serves as a seasonal storehouse of water. In the cool months, storms deposit snow across the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, the Wasatch, and the Rocky Mountains. This snow does not remain only as a white surface covering. It becomes a temporary reservoir, held in place by winter cold and released later through melting in many western river systems. This frozen reserve is one of the most important parts of the annual water cycle. The present drought threat grows more serious when this reserve forms poorly, melts too early, or fails to endure through the usual span of the cold season. This condition is often called snow drought, a period in which mountain snowpack falls below expected levels, either because too little precipitation arrives, because temperatures are too warm for snow to persist, or because both forces act together. Snowpack is the layered mass of accumulated snow that builds over weeks and months. Its importance lies not only in how much water it contains, but in the timing of its storage. Rain runs off quickly unless it is absorbed into soil or trapped in surface water. Snow, by contrast, holds water in solid form and delays its release. This delay is essential in the western United States, where dry summers are common and much of the annual precipitation arrives in winter. When snowpack is healthy, it acts as a slow account of moisture gathered in the cold season and saved for later. When snowpack is thin, the region enters spring with a weaker reserve, and the entire seasonal balance becomes more fragile. Snow drought takes more than one form. In some cases, the atmosphere simply fails to deliver enough precipitation to the mountains. Storms are fewer, weaker, or displaced, and snow totals remain low. In other cases, storms do arrive, yet warmer air changes the form of precipitation. Instead of snow, higher elevations receive rain or dense wet snow that melts quickly. This is a temperature-driven snow drought, in which the loss is caused not only by missing moisture, but by warmth that prevents stable storage. Observations across the West indicate that both types now occur, and that warming has made temperature-driven snow drought more common in many mountain regions. Elevation matters greatly in this process. The highest peaks often remain cold enough to retain snow longer, though even these zones are not fully shielded from warming trends. Middle elevations are more vulnerable because they sit near the freezing line, the boundary where conditions are cold enough for snow rather than rain. A small rise in temperature near this line can change the character of an entire storm. A basin that once fed a river through months of gradual melt may receive more of its winter moisture as rain. sending water downslope quickly and reducing the frozen reserve available later. The result is not always visible from a distance. Mountains may still appear snow-covered after a storm, yet the total water stored in that snow can be well below average. Scientists measure snowpack in terms of snow water equivalent, which means the amount of liquid water contained in the snow. This measurement matters because deep snow is not always water-rich snow. Light dry snow and dense wet snow can look similar across a broad slope, yet contain different amounts of stored water. Networks of mountain instruments, airborne surveys, satellite observations, and snow models help estimate these values across large regions. In drought years, these measurements often show deficits that spread across several mountain ranges at once. The snow may arrive late, remain patchy, or decline early in spring. Each of these patterns signals weakness in the seasonal storehouse. The structure of snowpack also responds to warmth in more subtle ways. Snow is not a static block. It changes with time as layers settle, compress, and sometimes melt and refreeze. When warm periods interrupt winter, the surface may soften and then harden again. Rain can pass into the snowpack and alter its density. These changes affect how the snow stores water and how it later releases it. A snowpack that forms through repeated cycles of warming and cooling may become less stable as a long-term reserve than one maintained under steadier cold conditions. Even when the final amount of snow seems moderate, its ability to persist into late spring may be reduced. The western United States depends heavily on this frozen reservoir because the region has a marked seasonal mismatch between water supply and water demand. The colder months bring most of the input, while the warmer months bring stronger plant growth, higher evaporation, and greater human use. Snow helps bridge this gap. Without it, much more of the winter moisture moves through the system too soon. It may flow into streams during periods when demand is still low, and then pass through reservoirs or river channels before the height of summer. This means that snow drought is not only a shortage of frozen water in the mountains, it is a disruption of the timing that Western landscapes and water systems have long relied upon. The link between snow drought and climate warming is now one of the clearest parts of the broader drought threat. Observations indicate declines in spring snowpack in many western mountains over recent decades, especially at lower and middle elevations. The exact pattern varies by range, storm season, and local weather conditions. Some high basins still receive heavy snow in favorable years. Some winters bring temporary recovery. It remains uncertain how individual mountain zones will respond in every future season, because storm paths and regional temperatures continue to vary from year to year. Yet the overall pattern is well established. Warmer winters reduce the chance that precipitation will remain stored as snow, and this weakens the resilience of the western water system. Snow drought also changes the visual character of the mountains. Slopes that would normally hold a continuous mantle of snow show darker ground earlier in the season. Forest bands emerge sooner, exposed ridges widen, sunlight reaches bare patches and warms them further, which can accelerate local melting. This shift in surface condition matters because bright snow reflects much of the incoming sunlight, while darker ground absorbs more of it. When snow cover shrinks, the land tends to warm more quickly, and the snow that remains faces a less favourable setting. In this way, a thin snow year can reinforce itself through the changing surface of the mountains. Within the drought story, the mountain snow zone marks a transition from atmospheric control to physical storage. Storms bring the moisture, but snow decides whether that moisture remains available for later seasons. When the snow zone weakens, the whole western system becomes less buffered against heat and dryness. Rivers begin with a smaller reserve than expected. Reservoirs wait for water that may not arrive in the usual way. Soil and vegetation lose the gradual support of prolonged melt. The mountains continue to gather winter weather, but their role as frozen storage becomes less reliable. In that reduced reliability lies one of the central dangers of the present drought threat across the United States. When the mountain snowpack survives the winter, it does not all leave at once. It passes into spring under the influence of sunlight, air temperature, wind, cloud cover, and the shape of the land. This seasonal release is called snowmelt, the process by which stored snow turns into liquid water and begins to move downslope. In the western United States, the timing of this release is as important as the amount. A steady and gradual melt extends the availability of water across weeks and months. An early melt shifts that water forward in the calendar, sending it into streams before the warmer part of the year has fully arrived. In the present drought threat, this earlier release has become a defining change in the way mountain water enters the wider landscape. Snow begins to melt when it receives more energy than it loses. Sunlight provides much of this energy, especially in spring when days lengthen and the angle of the sun rises. Warm air adds energy through contact with the snow surface. Wind can increase the exchange of heat and moisture between snow and air. Rain falling on snow can also contribute warmth, especially when the rain is mild and persistent. Against these gains, snow loses energy through nighttime cooling and the release of heat to colder air. The balance of these exchanges determines whether the snow remains solid, softens, or turns to water. In a cooler climate, this balance favours a slower transition. Under warmer conditions, the balance shifts toward earlier and faster melt. The date of snow melt does not depend on spring alone. It is shaped by what happens through the whole cold season. A thin snowpack warms more quickly than a deep one because there is less mass to absorb incoming energy. Snow that accumulates late in winter enters spring with less time to build depth and persistence. Snow that is interrupted by warm spells may become dense, patchy, and uneven, which changes how it responds to later sunlight and warmth. By the time spring arrives, the character of the melt season has already been partly decided by the quality of the winter storage. In many western mountain basins, observations show that peak snowmelt and the resulting peak runoff now tend to occur earlier than in the past. This does not happen in every year or every place to the same degree. Weather variability remains large, and cool, wet springs can still slow the release. Yet the overall pattern in many records points toward earlier movement of water out of the snow zone. This shift is linked to warmer spring temperatures and to a greater fraction of winter precipitation falling as rain rather than snow. The stored water enters motion sooner, and the long seasonal bridge between winter and summer becomes shorter. A gradual melt is useful because it spreads water through time. It allows some of the liquid water to soak into soils, some to recharge shallow groundwater, and some to feed streams in a sustained way. Plants emerging in spring benefit from this steady supply. Reservoir operators can capture some of the flow while still leaving room for later inflow. River ecosystems also tend to function best when snowmelt follows a seasonal rhythm rather than arriving in a compressed burst. When melting begins early and proceeds rapidly, this balance changes. Water may surge into channels during a period when downstream demand is still modest, then decline sharply later when heat and use increase. The shape of the land affects this timing. South-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere receive stronger sunlight in spring and often lose snow sooner than north-facing slopes. Lower elevations warm earlier than higher ones. Open ground melts sooner than shaded forests in some conditions. Though forest effects are complex because trees can reduce sunlight at the surface while also influencing wind and long-wave heat exchange. The result is a mosaic of melting across the mountains rather than a single uniform event. In a stable climate, this mosaic produces a staggered release, with different slopes and elevations contributing water at different times. As temperatures rise, more of this mosaic shifts forward together, and the sequence compresses. The early release of meltwater creates a subtle form of shortage. The total amount of water entering streams in a season may not vanish immediately, yet its usefulness changes because it arrives out of step with later need. Water that moves through channels in early spring can be difficult to retain in full, especially if reservoirs are already constrained by storage rules, sediment, flood control needs, or limited remaining capacity. Some of it passes onward before the hottest and driest part of the year. By midsummer, river levels may then fall more sharply than they would under a slower melt. This means that earlier snowmelt can intensify summer drought even in a year when spring landscapes briefly appear moist. Temperature at night has an important role in this shift. In colder mountain climates, freezing nights help preserve snow between warm days, slowing the overall rate of loss. As nighttime temperatures rise, the pause becomes weaker. Melt can continue across a larger share of the daily cycle. Snow that once refroze firmly may remain soft or wet, leaving it more vulnerable to the next day's warmth. This change is especially important in the weeks when the snowpack transitions from winter storage to active release. A sequence of mild nights can move that transition forward noticeably. Cloud cover also matters. Clear skies often bring strong daytime sunlight that enhances melting, though they can also allow colder nights. Cloudy conditions reduce direct sunlight but may keep nights warmer. The exact effect depends on the season, elevation, and storm pattern. Rain-on-snow events are especially influential because they combine warm air, liquid water, and often strong winds. Such events can accelerate melt rapidly, particularly in middle elevations where temperatures hover near freezing. Observations indicate that warming increases the likelihood that some storms at these elevations will fall as rain, which can further disturb the traditional timing of spring release. It remains uncertain how much earlier snowmelt will occur in each mountain region in any specific future decade, because local weather, terrain, and storm behavior differ widely. Some high elevations still preserve a more traditional pattern in snowy years. Some basins remain strongly controlled by individual large storms rather than gradual average change. Even with this uncertainty, the broader finding is clear. Warmer conditions are shifting the timing of snowmelt earlier in many parts of the western United States, and this change reduces the effectiveness of mountain snow as a seasonal reservoir. In the drought story, earlier melt is not simply a sign that spring arrives sooner in the high country. It is a change in the calendar of water itself. The mountains still receive winter moisture in many years, but the release of that moisture is less delayed than before. The pause that once held water in cold storage into late spring and early summer becomes shorter. The snow line retreats upward sooner, streams respond earlier. By the time summer heat strengthens across the west, less of the frozen reserve remains in place. The landscape has already spent part of its seasonal savings. What follows is a drier warm season, supported by a weaker carryover from the mountains, and the drought threat deepens through timing as much as through quantity. Below the mountain snowfields, the first visible movement of stored winter water appears in headwater streams. These small channels begin high in the terrain, often as narrow courses cut through rock, meadow, or forest soil. They gather water from melting snow, shallow springs, and occasional rain, then join with one another to form the upper branches of larger rivers. In the western United States, these headwater streams are the earliest liquid expression of mountain storage. They show how much water the high country has truly saved, how steadily that water is being released, and how the drought is taking shape before it becomes obvious far downstream. A headwater stream is usually modest in size, yet it carries information about the state of the whole basin above it. If the snowpack is deep and the melt is gradual, the stream often rises in a measured way through spring. Its flow remains cool, persistent, and relatively stable from day to day, apart from weather shifts. If the snowpack is thin or melts too early, the stream behaves differently. It may rise quickly during warm spells and then drop sooner than expected. It may reach its seasonal peak early and spend more of the warm months at unusually low levels. By observing these streams over time, hydrologists, meaning scientists who study the movement of water, can see how drought moves from the mountain storehouse into the running network below. The amount of water in a stream is called stream flow. It is measured at gauging stations placed along channels, where instruments record water level and calculate how much water passes a point over time. These records reveal the seasonal pulse of western basins in many drought-affected watersheds. The pulse now arrives earlier and weakens sooner. The hydrograph, which is the curve of stream flow through time, rises in spring but often crests before the historical norm. After that crest, the line declines more steeply. This pattern tells a quiet story of reduced storage and earlier release. The stream is still alive with motion, but its seasonal endurance is shorter. Headwater streams are especially sensitive because they respond quickly to conditions in the basin around them. Large rivers have many tributaries and storage influences, which can smooth out short-term changes. Small upper channels do not have that buffer. A warm week can increase flow sharply if snow is still present. A dry spell can reduce flow just as sharply when the available source water is already diminished. These streams therefore act like fine instruments, detecting the early stages of hydrologic drought, which is drought expressed in reduced stream flow, lake levels, and groundwater rather than only in lack of rainfall. The physical setting of headwater streams also matters. Some channels flow over bedrock and steep slopes, sending meltwater quickly downslope. Others cross meadows and alluvial soils, which are loose river-deposited sediments that can absorb and release water more slowly. Meadow systems can act as local sponges, spreading water laterally, supporting wet soils and sustaining base flow. The portion of stream flow supplied by delayed drainage from soil and shallow groundwater rather than by direct runoff. In drought years, these meadow and soil stores often fail to fill completely. Without that hidden support, streams fall more quickly after the first melt pulse passes. Temperature affects headwater streams in another direct way. Lower flow usually means warmer water, especially when channels are shallow and exposed to sun. Cool mountain streams are important for aquatic life, including fish and insects adapted to cold, oxygen-rich water. During drought, reduced flow and warmer conditions can narrow the range of suitable habitat. Pools shrink, riffles slow, and the stream becomes less connected across its full length. In severe cases, short reaches may become intermittent, meaning they stop flowing continuously and break into isolated pools or dry patches. This is not the normal seasonal condition for many perennial headwaters, which usually flow year-round. It is a sign that the high-elevation water reserve has weakened enough to affect the continuity of the channel itself. Rainfall can complicate the picture. A summer storm may briefly raise stream flow, and a series of cool, wet days can delay the visible decline. Yet these interruptions do not necessarily repair the deeper deficit. If the snowpack was low and the basin did not recharge fully, The stream often returns quickly to reduced flow after the weather change passes. This is why headwater observations must be read over the full season rather than in isolated moments. A single surge can look healthy, but the longer record reveals whether the basin is maintaining water or merely passing brief inputs through a depleted system. The link between headwater streams and larger drought risk becomes stronger when many basins show the same pattern at once. One small stream running low may reflect a local issue of geology, forest cover, or recent weather. Dozens of upper tributaries declining early across several mountain ranges indicate a regional hydrologic signal. Observations across the western United States in drought periods often show this alignment. Snowmelt-fed streams rise earlier, peak sooner, and reach summer low flow ahead of schedule. The effect then moves downstream through the river network, influencing water supply far from the mountain source. There is still uncertainty in the exact response of each headwater stream because local factors matter greatly. Slope, elevation, basin shape, soil depth, vegetation, and groundwater connection can all modify how a stream reacts to snow loss and warmth. Some streams are strongly spring-fed and therefore more stable. Some catchments store more water in deep soils or fractured rock. Some retain snow longer because of shade or exposure. These differences explain why drought is not identical from one mountain valley to the next. Even so, the overall pattern is consistent with current scientific understanding. Thinner snowpack, earlier melt, and higher evaporative demand reduce the duration and reliability of headwater flow. The ecological meaning of this change is subtle but broad. Headwater streams do more than convey water. They transport sediment, nutrients, and organic matter from uplands into wider river systems. They support wet meadows, riparian plants, insects, amphibians, and birds. When streamflow weakens early, these connected processes weaken as well. The upper basin becomes less effective at storing, cooling, and gradually releasing water. What appears at first to be a small reduction in a narrow channel is, in fact, a reduction in the functional life of the landscape around it. In the structure of the drought threat, headwater streams mark the point where frozen mountain storage becomes moving evidence. They translate the condition of snow and soil into flowing water that can be measured day by day. Their narrow channels carry the signature of warm winters, early melt, and incomplete recharge. By the time these streams begin to shrink ahead of season, the drought has already passed through the sky, through the mountain snow zone, and into the first running veins of the basin. The change is modest in appearance, yet decisive in meaning. The upper channels tell the truth early, quietly showing that the water year is already running short. As the headwater streams leave the high country, they begin to join one another in a branching pattern that gives shape to the basin. Small channels become forks, forks become tributaries, and tributaries merge into the main arteries of the interior west. In this larger network, the water gathered from snow, rain, soil, and shallow groundwater is no longer expressed as isolated mountain flow. It becomes a moving system of connected rivers that cross plateaus, cut through canyons, enter reservoirs, and support distant lands. In the western United States, no river shows this cumulative process more clearly than the Colorado River and its basin. Here the drought threat becomes visible not only as local reduction, but as a regional accounting of loss. A river basin is the full land area from which water drains toward a common outlet or main channel. The Colorado River basin spans high mountains, dry uplands, desert valleys, and deeply incised river corridors across several states. Water that falls as snow in the upper basin may travel hundreds of kilometers before reaching the lower reaches of the river system. Along the way, the river receives contributions from many tributaries, yet it also loses water to evaporation, seepage into surrounding ground, and human withdrawal. In a healthy water year, enough input arrives from the basin's upper elevations to keep the river moving with relative strength through much of the warm season. In a drought year, the network still functions, but the combined volume falls short of what the system has long been asked to provide. The joining of tributaries might suggest stability. A large river seems stronger than the small channels that feed it, and in some ways it is. A wide basin can spread risk because one tributary may run low while another receives a better share of snow or rain. Yet this same structure can also spread drought when deficits occur across many headwaters at once. A single dry stream is local. A basin-wide pattern of thin snowpack, early melt, and reduced summer flow produces a compound effect. Each tributary arrives smaller than expected. By the time these waters join, the shortfall is no longer subtle. It has accumulated through distance and through repeated merging of reduced inputs. The upper Colorado River and its major tributaries depend strongly on mountain snowfall in places such as Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. These upper reaches provide a large share of the water that later moves through the whole basin. The lower basin, by contrast, is much hotter and drier, with far less natural runoff of its own. This means the larger river system depends on transporting water from cooler, wetter elevations into landscapes where evaporation is stronger and natural replacement is weak. The structure works only when the upper arteries deliver enough flow. When they do not, the entire downstream system feels the strain. River flow in a basin is shaped by timing as much as amount. Early snowmelt can send water into the main river sooner, raising flows in spring and then leaving less available in later summer. Warm temperatures along the river corridor increase evaporation from channels, wetlands, and reservoirs. Dry soils along tributaries may absorb more of the first runoff after a dry period, reducing the fraction that actually reaches the main stem. Vegetation along banks and floodplains also takes up moisture during the growing season. None of these losses are abnormal on their own. They are part of the ordinary function of a river system. Under drought, however, they consume a larger share of a smaller supply. The main stem of the Colorado River reveals this cumulative shortage in a measured way. Gauging stations show reduced discharge, which means reduced volume of water passing a point through time. Reservoir inflows fall below expectation. Side channels and backwaters shrink. Sediment bars become more exposed. In some reaches, the river continues to appear large because dams and diversions regulate its flow. Yet the appearance can hide the accounting behind it. A managed river may keep moving past a given point, while the stored reserves behind that movement steadily decline. The drought therefore exists both in the visible channel and in the hidden budget that supports it. Tributaries contribute differently depending on their geography. Some rise in snow-rich mountains and provide a pronounced spring pulse. Others drain drier uplands and respond more directly to occasional rain. In a balanced system, this diversity helps extend river flow through the year. Under a broad drought pattern, many tributary types weaken together. Snow-fed branches arrive early and fade. Rain-fed branches remain unreliable because storms are sparse, and intense heat dries the land between them. The river then loses not only volume but seasonal texture. Instead of a distributed sequence of inflows, it receives a narrower and less durable contribution from across the basin. The drought threat in these basin arteries is also shaped by travel time. Water does not move instantaneously from headwaters to lower reaches. It passes through channels, floodplains, and storage zones that each alter its pace and availability. During this movement, losses accumulate. Some water infiltrates into riverbanks and near-channel sediments, later returning to the channel under favourable conditions. Some enters shallow aquifers and remains there longer. Some is evaporated under sun and dry air. In a wetter regime, these exchanges can support resilience by storing and slowly returning part of the flow. In a drier and warmer regime, the same exchanges may result in net depletion because the returning fraction is smaller and the atmospheric losses are greater. There is also a difference between weather drought and river drought. Weather drought begins with reduced precipitation or unusual warmth. River drought appears when the integrated consequences of those conditions reach the channel network. Because the basin averages many processes over space and time, river drought can persist even after a wet spell. One strong storm may swell a tributary for a few days, but it does not necessarily restore the broader flow deficit. The main arteries of the basin respond to the total condition of snow storage, seasonal melt, soil moisture, groundwater support, and evaporative loss. This is why river recovery is often slower than the arrival of rain. Scientific observations indicate that the Colorado River Basin has experienced long-term reductions in flow compared with earlier 20th century averages, and warming is understood to be a major factor in this decline. Studies point to a combination of reduced snowpack, increased evaporative demand, and altered runoff efficiency, meaning a smaller fraction of precipitation ultimately reaches the river as streamflow. It remains uncertain how much year-to-year storm variability may temporarily ease or intensify this pattern in any given season. It is also uncertain how individual tributaries will respond under future combinations of snow, heat, and land cover change. Even so, the broader signal is firm. The basin arteries are carrying less reliable water than the system was built around. In this river network, drought is no longer confined to isolated slopes or streams. It has entered the central circulation of the western interior. Tributaries that should reinforce one another now bring shared weakness. The main stem continues its course across desert and stone, but it does so with a thinner margin than before. Each confluence gathers water, and each confluence also gathers the consequences of earlier deficits. By the time the basin arteries are running lean, the drought has become regional in full measure, expressed in the very channels that bind the interior west together. Along the course of the great western rivers, the water that leaves mountains and tributaries is gathered again into large reservoirs. These are artificial lakes held behind dams, built to store seasonal runoff, reduce flood risk, generate electricity, and deliver water across long distances. In the western United States, reservoirs are more than engineering structures. They are exposed surfaces where the balance between natural supply and human demand becomes visible in open air. When inflow declines and heat persists, reservoir levels fall, shorelines retreat, pale mineral bands appear on rock walls, marinas sit farther from deep water than they once did. The surface remains calm, yet it quietly records the widening gap between what the basin receives and what the basin removes. A reservoir stores water by slowing a river and spreading it across a larger area. This storage provides flexibility through time. Water that arrives during spring snowmelt can be held for summer irrigation, urban use, and power generation. In dry regions, this ability to shift water from one season to another has been central to settlement and agriculture, yet the same design creates a vulnerability. Once river water is spread into a broad open surface under sun and dry air, some of it is lost directly back to the atmosphere through evaporation. In cooler or wetter climates, this may be modest compared with total volume. In the hot and arid interior west, evaporation is a constant part of the accounting. The large reservoirs of the Colorado River system, including Lake Powell and Lake Mead, reveal this tension clearly. They were built during a period when river flow was understood through a limited historical window that happened to include relatively wet conditions. Over time, the river has provided less dependable flow than those early assumptions suggested. In recent decades, prolonged drought and warming have reduced inflow, while the demands placed on stored water have remained high. As a result, reservoir levels have often declined well below the conditions that earlier management expected to be normal. The reservoir surface then becomes a plain record of cumulative imbalance. A falling reservoir is not only a container with less water in it, its geometry changes as it declines. Deep water retreats from the margins, exposing mud, gravel, old river terraces, and rock. Shallow sidearms narrow, boat channels become difficult to navigate. Intakes used for water supply and hydropower approach levels at which operations become more constrained. These changes matter because reservoirs are built to serve several purposes at once. A reduction in storage can affect not only water delivery but also electricity production, recreation, ecological habitat, and water quality. The physical shrinking of the surface is therefore tied to a wider contraction of function. Evaporation from reservoirs is driven by heat, dry air, wind, and the amount of exposed surface area. Warm conditions encourage liquid water to become vapor. Low humidity allows the air above the surface to accept more moisture. Wind removes humid air from just above the water and replaces it with drier air, sustaining the process. In drought periods, these conditions often become more favorable for evaporation at the same time that the stored supply is already reduced. The loss is rarely dramatic in a single day, yet it continues steadily through the warm season. Across large reservoirs and across many years, that steady loss becomes substantial. Water quality changes as levels fall. In deep reservoirs, the water column often separates into layers of different temperature. Warmer, lighter water stays near the surface while cooler. Denser water remains below. This layering can influence oxygen levels, nutrient cycling, and the conditions experienced by aquatic organisms. When storage declines, the structure of these layers can shift. Shallow margins warm more quickly. Sediments that were long submerged may become exposed and then reworked by waves and wind. Concentrations of dissolved minerals can increase as the same basin holds less water. These are not always immediate threats to use, but they show that low reservoir levels alter more than volume alone. The reservoir surface also reveals how time works differently in drought. A river channel responds quickly to storms and melt pulses, rising and falling over days or weeks. A major reservoir responds more slowly. It integrates many inflows and outflows over seasons and years. This means a single wet winter may raise levels somewhat, and a sequence of wet years may restore substantial storage. But recovery is often slower than decline when the underlying climate remains warm and demand stays high. A reservoir can therefore appear to improve for a time without escaping the deeper vulnerability created by repeated long dry periods. Management decisions shape the surface as well. Reservoirs are not passive basins. Operators release water according to legal rules, downstream obligations, power needs, flood control requirements, and forecasts of future inflow. During shortage, these decisions become more difficult because each release serves one purpose while reducing flexibility for another. Holding more water back may protect future supply, but reduce downstream deliveries now. Releasing more water may sustain current use while increasing the risk of critically low storage later. The surface level at any moment is therefore partly natural and partly managed. though management cannot create water that the basin has not received. Scientific understanding of Western reservoir decline points to a combination of lower runoff, higher temperature, and sustained withdrawals. Observations indicate that warming reduces the efficiency with which precipitation becomes river flow, and that this effect contributes to weaker inflow even in years that are not extremely dry by precipitation alone. It remains uncertain exactly how much any future wet period will rebuild storage, because that depends on the sequence of storms, the form of precipitation, and the pattern of use during and after recovery. Still, the consensus is clear that large reservoirs in the western United States now operate under more frequent stress than in the past. There is also a visual discipline to the reservoir surface, unlike snowpack or soil moisture, which can be difficult to judge without instruments. Reservoir level is immediately legible. The exposed ring on canyon walls marks previous high water. The distance from boat ramp to shoreline marks present decline. The narrowing of coves and the emergence of islands make shortage concrete in a way that statistics alone cannot. For this reason, reservoirs have become symbols of Western drought. Though they are better understood as indicators than as causes, they show the accumulated outcome of conditions that began in the atmosphere, the mountains, and the tributary network. In the structure of the drought threat, the reservoir surface is the broad mirror that receives all earlier deficits. Missed storms, thin snowpack, early melt, reduced headwater flow, and weakened river arteries all arrive here as diminished storage. Once spread across open water, the shortage becomes visible and measurable in the downward drift of the shoreline. The reservoir continues to hold great volumes by ordinary human scale, yet its margin for error narrows under sun and dry wind. Even stored water is not secure. It waits in exposed silence, serving many needs at once while slowly surrendering part of itself to the air above. The great western reservoirs thus stand as calm but exact witnesses to the present drought threat, their surfaces receding under the combined weight of climate, basin hydrology, and use. Below the visible decline of the reservoirs lies a less visible layer of the drought threat, the system by which river water is divided, promised, and delivered. In the western United States, and especially in the Colorado River Basin, water does not move only according to gravity and climate. It also moves according to legal agreements, operating rules, accounting systems, and long-standing assumptions about how much the river can provide. This layer is often called allocation, the planned distribution of water among states, communities, farms, tribes, industries, and ecosystems. In a wetter river, allocation can appear stable because the promised shares seem to fit within the available supply. In a drier river, the mismatch becomes plain. The drought then enters not only the physical channel, but the structure of expectation built around it. Allocation begins with measurement. River managers estimate how much water enters the basin from snowmelt and rain, how much is stored in reservoirs, and how much is being withdrawn or released. These numbers guide decisions about delivery, yet all measurements are shaped by history. The Colorado River system was developed during a period when the river was understood through records that did not fully capture its long-term variability. Later study shows that the 20th century included years of relatively high flow, compared with some earlier periods preserved in tree rings and other natural records. As a result, the framework of allocation grows from assumptions that often exceed what the river can reliably sustain under present conditions. This does not mean the river was divided carelessly. The system was built to organize a scarce resource across a vast and growing region. States negotiated shares. Reservoirs were constructed to smooth dry years. Delivery rules were written to provide order in place of uncertainty. For many decades, this arrangement supported major agricultural districts and expanding cities. The problem emerges because the physical river changes while the legal and administrative structure changes more slowly. Drought exposes this difference in pace. The natural system responds immediately to a thin snow year or a run of hot seasons. The allocation system responds through negotiation, shortage declarations, revised operating plans, and sometimes conflict over who must take less. A river allocation is not the same as water physically present in the channel at every moment. It is a claim on future delivery, built on the expectation that stored water and incoming flow together will satisfy that claim. In dry times, managers may reduce releases or impose shortage tiers, which are structured levels of mandatory cutback based on reservoir conditions and projected inflow. These tiers show that allocation is not fixed in practice, even if many claims are fixed in law or contract. When storage falls low enough, the system begins to ration scarcity. The river is still being divided, but it is divided under strain. The distinction between upper and lower basin use becomes important here. The upper basin contributes much of the natural runoff, especially from mountain snow. The lower basin, with its hotter and drier landscapes, depends strongly on stored and transported water. This geographic contrast means that allocation is also a matter of distance. Water originating in cold headwaters supports uses far downstream in places that could not rely on local runoff alone. When the river is abundant enough, this distance can be managed through reservoirs and release schedules. When the river weakens, the distance magnifies tension because many forms of use depend on water that must travel far from where it naturally enters the system. Agriculture is central within this layer because irrigation districts hold large rights to river water in many parts of the West. These rights often reflect historical patterns of development, with some users holding earlier and therefore more secure claims under prior appropriation, a legal principle in which earlier water use may receive stronger protection than later use. Cities, meanwhile, have grown rapidly and seek stable supplies for millions of residents. Tribal water rights add another essential dimension, rooted in legal obligations and long-standing presence that were often under-recognized in earlier management. Environmental flows, the water needed to support riverine and wetland ecosystems, are often the least protected within heavily allocated systems. Drought does not create these competing needs, but it compresses them into sharper contact. The practical effect of over-allocation becomes clear when reservoir levels continue to fall despite ongoing management. If promised use remains greater than the average long-term supply, storage is gradually consumed to maintain deliveries. In a short drought, reservoirs may buffer that gap. In a prolonged dry period, the buffer erodes. The system then reaches a point where shortage is no longer an exceptional condition, but a structural feature of operation. Water managers must decide how to distribute less than what many users have come to expect. This is not only a policy problem, it is the hydrologic expression of a river whose average yield has declined under warmer conditions. Evaporation and transit losses also matter within allocation. Water released from a reservoir does not arrive intact at every downstream destination. Some is lost from surfaces, canals, and conveyance structures. Some seeps into surrounding ground. These losses are usually included in broad system accounting, yet they become more consequential when total available water shrinks. A quantity that seemed manageable in a fuller system becomes significant in a reduced one. The same is true of inefficiencies in irrigation and distribution. Under abundance, they may be tolerated. Under drought, they become part of the shortage. Uncertainty remains in how the allocation framework will evolve. Negotiations can revise operating rules, conservation can reduce demand, infrastructure can shift the timing and route of deliveries, wet years can offer temporary relief and create space for agreement. It remains uncertain exactly how future legal and administrative changes will be distributed among states and user groups, and uncertain how rapidly institutions can adapt to the pace of physical change. What is already known is that the present drought threat is not explained by climate alone. It is intensified by a management structure designed for a river that is now less generous than the one earlier planners believed they had. This makes drought in the allocation layer a matter of mismatch. The river's physical supply is shaped by storms, snow, melt timing, evaporation, and runoff efficiency. The claims placed on that supply are shaped by law, history, infrastructure, and social need. When both sides are aligned, the system can function with relative calm. When they separate, the strain appears first in emergency planning and then in visible cutbacks. Reservoirs decline, deliveries tighten, and the river is asked to satisfy obligations that exceed its current ability to comply. In this part of the drought story, the danger is not only that there is less water in motion, it is that less water must pass through a framework built on larger expectations. The river becomes thinner while the network of dependence around it remains broad. Allocation then reveals drought as a human arrangement under physical correction. The old shares persist on paper, but the living river no longer meets them with ease. Across the basin, scarcity enters contracts, schedules, and negotiations, becoming as much a feature of governance as of climate. The drought has now moved from open water into the rules that organize it, and the imbalance grows more intimate and more difficult to hide. Beyond the regulated rivers and storage reservoirs, drought takes on a different form across irrigated farmland. Here water leaves the main channels and enters a managed landscape of canals, ditches, pumps, gates, fields, and furrows. The change is immediate in scale and texture. Wide water bodies and long river corridors give way to parcels of cultivated ground, each one shaped by crop type, soil condition, weather, and the amount of water that can be delivered at the proper time. In the western United States, irrigation allows agriculture to exist in places where rainfall alone would not support such production. This makes farmland one of the clearest places where the basin's larger drought becomes a daily matter of choices made on the land. Irrigation is the artificial application of water to crops. Its purpose is simple. It supplies moisture when natural precipitation is insufficient or poorly timed. Yet the practice itself is varied. Some fields receive water by flood irrigation, where water spreads across the surface and infiltrates into the soil. Some use sprinklers, which distribute water through the air in rotating arcs or fine sprays. Some use drip systems, which place water close to plant roots through tubes and emitters. Each method differs in cost, efficiency, labor, and suitability for specific crops. Under drought, those differences matter more because the gap between water desired and water available becomes sharper. The soil in irrigated fields acts as the immediate store from which crops draw moisture. When irrigation arrives in adequate amounts, the upper and middle soil layers retain enough water to support plant growth between applications. Roots extend through these layers, taking up water and dissolved nutrients. Under drought, this soil reservoir becomes harder to maintain. Deliveries may be reduced, delayed, or priced in ways that force stricter allocation. Heat increases evaporation from bare soil and transpiration from plants, which together remove water more quickly from the root zone. A field that once remained adequately moist between scheduled deliveries may now dry sooner, leaving crops under greater stress. Crop stress appears first in subtle ways. Leaves may curl, dull, or angle differently under intense heat. Growth slows. The plant begins to regulate water loss by narrowing or closing tiny pores on the leaf surface. This conserves moisture for a time, but also reduces the intake of carbon dioxide needed for photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert light into stored chemical energy. As the stress continues, flowering, fruit set, grain filling, or root development may be reduced. The exact response depends on the crop and on the stage of growth. A brief shortage at one point in the season may have little effect, while the same shortage at a critical stage can reduce yield sharply. Different crops face drought with different levels of vulnerability. Annual crops, which complete their life cycle in a single growing season, can sometimes be reduced or abandoned if water is too limited. Perennial crops, such as orchards and vineyards, present a more difficult situation. Trees and vines represent years of investment and cannot be set aside without long-term loss. When water is scarce, growers may choose to fallow some annual fields, meaning they leave them unplanted, in order to preserve water for higher-value perennial crops. This response shows how drought reshapes not only plant growth, but the economic pattern of the agricultural landscape. The soil itself changes under repeated dryness. When moisture declines, soil aggregates can break down, surface crusts can form, and fine particles may become more vulnerable to erosion by wind. In heavier soils, drying can produce cracks that alter how later irrigation water enters the ground. In sandy soils, low moisture means water passes quickly downward, reducing the time roots have to use it unless irrigation is carefully timed. Organic matter, the decomposed plant and animal material that helps soil retain water, becomes especially important in drought because it improves the soil's capacity to hold moisture. Fields with healthier soil structure may endure short dry periods better than degraded fields, though even well-managed soils cannot compensate fully for major water shortages. Salinity becomes a greater concern in dry irrigated regions. Salts are naturally present in soils and in irrigation water to varying degrees. When enough clean water moves through the soil, some of these salts are flushed downward or away from the root zone. When water becomes scarce, that flushing weakens. Evaporation from the soil surface can then leave salts behind in the upper layers, making it harder for plants to take up water even when some moisture is present. This creates a double burden. The field is dry, and the remaining soil water becomes less accessible to crops because of the salts dissolved in it. Over time, salinity can reduce productivity and require even more careful management. Heat intensifies every part of this agricultural drought. Warmer air raises crop water demand. Sunlit surfaces lose more moisture. Irrigation water applied by sprinklers may partly evaporate before it even reaches the soil, especially under windy, hot conditions. Livestock operations also feel the pressure through higher drinking water needs and reduced quality of pasture or forage. The field is therefore not an isolated unit. It is part of a broader farm system in which drought affects crops. Animals, labour schedules, power use for pumping, and financial risk all at once. Farmers respond with a range of adjustments. They may change planting dates, switch to less water-demanding crops, improve irrigation scheduling, use soil moisture sensors, line canals to reduce seepage, or adopt more efficient delivery systems. These measures can reduce losses and stretch available supply. They are important and often effective at the field scale, yet they do not remove the larger hydrologic limit imposed by a drier basin. Efficiency can help a given amount of water go farther, but it cannot restore the snowpack, refill a depleted reservoir, or create runoff that the river has not produced. This is why agricultural adaptation, though essential, remains bounded by the physical state of the wider water system. Uncertainty remains in how each farming region will absorb ongoing drought pressure, because outcomes depend on crop mix, local water rights, soil type, infrastructure, and market conditions. Some districts with senior water rights may retain more reliable deliveries than others. Some farms can invest in efficient systems, while others cannot. Some areas may receive temporary relief from a wet year or from transferred water, while others remain exposed. Even with these differences, the overall scientific and practical understanding is consistent. Irrigated agriculture in the western United States is highly sensitive to reduced water supply and increased evaporative demand, and drought deepens that sensitivity across both land and livelihood. In this inward movement of the drought story, irrigated fields show how basin-scale shortage becomes biological and material at the ground surface. Water that once seemed abundant in distant reservoirs is now measured in turnouts, soil moisture, and the condition of leaves under sun. The Broad River shortage narrows into decisions about which field receives water, how much can be applied, and what the plant can endure. The land remains cultivated, orderly, and productive where enough water still arrives, yet the margin around that productivity grows thinner. Drought here is no longer only a matter of storage and law. It settles into the soil around roots, into the timing of irrigation, and into the visible effort to hold growth in place on a drying landscape. Away from the open fields and canal grids, drought enters the built landscape of cities and suburbs. Here the signs are quieter and more regulated. Water arrives through pipes rather than rivers, through treatment plants rather than stream channels, through reservoirs and distant diversions hidden behind ordinary walls, streets, and gardens. The urban landscape can seem detached from the climate that surrounds it. Yet its apparent stability depends on a long chain of stored and transported water that begins far beyond the city edge. In the western United States, large metropolitan areas often depend on mountain snow, river reservoirs, groundwater, and imported supplies from distant basins. When drought reduces these sources, the city does not stand apart from scarcity. It reorganizes itself around it. Urban water use includes several layers. Water is needed indoors for drinking, cooking, bathing, cleaning, and sanitation. It is also used outdoors for lawns, trees, parks, medians, gardens, cooling, and other landscape needs. In many Western cities, outdoor use forms a large share of residential demand, especially during the hottest months. This seasonal pattern matters because it aligns with the period when natural water availability is often lowest. Snowmelt has already passed its peak. Stream flows have begun to decline, and reservoir levels are under pressure from both heat and delivery obligations. The urban warm season therefore sits directly on top of the basin's driest period. Cities often soften drought through infrastructure. Reservoirs store water across seasons. Aqueducts carry it across mountains and deserts. Treatment plants make use of poorer quality supplies. Some regions blend surface water with groundwater, reuse treated wastewater for irrigation or industry, or exchange water between agencies through large distribution networks. These systems create resilience, meaning the capacity to absorb dry periods without immediate collapse of service. Yet resilience is not abundance, it is a managed buffer. When drought persists across several years, the buffers thin, and even large cities begin to feel the need for visible restraint. Conservation becomes one of the first major urban responses. This can include limits on lawn watering, restrictions on the days and hours when outdoor irrigation is allowed, incentives for replacing turf with drought-tolerant plants, leak repair programs, and standards for water-efficient appliances and fixtures. These measures work because a city contains many small points of use, and modest reductions across millions of people can produce meaningful savings. The science of urban demand shows that behavior, technology, and price signals can all influence how much water a city consumes. In drought, these tools become part of the city's hydrology, shaping how long-stored supplies can last. The suburban landscape is especially revealing in this regard. Suburbs often contain detached homes, yards, driveways, and ornamental plantings spread across a large area. In wetter climates, green lawns may reflect the natural rhythm of rain and soil moisture. In the dry interior West, such landscapes are often maintained only through irrigation. During drought, the cost of this artificial greenness becomes more visible. Brown grass, reduced irrigation, and a shift toward native or desert-adapted plants mark not only aesthetic change but hydrologic adjustment. The built environment begins to reflect the actual climate more closely when water becomes too scarce to support earlier choices. Trees in cities present a more complex picture. Urban tree cover cools neighborhoods, improves air quality, reduces heat stress, and provides ecological value. Yet trees also require water, especially in hot, dry settings and in paved environments where soil volume is limited. During drought, cities face difficult trade-offs. Preserving mature trees may justify some continued outdoor watering, even as lawns are allowed to dry. The decision is grounded in the fact that trees represent long-term investment and perform functions that grass does not. Drought, therefore, does not simply reduce outdoor water use across the board. It rearranges priorities within the urban landscape. Heat strongly amplifies city demand. High temperatures increase outdoor watering needs, raise losses from evaporative cooling systems, and elevate the public need for safe, cooled indoor spaces. Urban areas also experience the heat island effect, in which buildings, pavement, and reduced vegetation cause local temperatures to remain higher than nearby rural surroundings, especially at night. This added warmth increases water demand at the same time that it stresses people, infrastructure, and power systems. Drought and urban heat thus reinforce one another. Dry landscapes lose some of their cooling through evaporation from soil and leaves, while hotter conditions raise the desire for water use to maintain comfort and greenery. The city's dependence on distant sources makes drought both material and abstract. A resident may see water emerge reliably from a tap without ever seeing the watershed, river, or reservoir from which it came. This separation can hide the physical origin of supply, yet utilities must track it constantly. They watch snowpack reports, runoff forecasts, reservoir levels, groundwater conditions, and river agreements. Urban reliability is therefore maintained by active interpretation of the broader hydrologic system. When drought deepens, utilities often respond before households notice direct shortage, reducing pressure in the system through conservation campaigns, altered pricing, temporary restrictions, or increased use of backup sources. Equity becomes important within this urban drought layer. Not all neighborhoods experience water scarcity in the same way. Wealthier areas may have greater access to efficient technology, landscape redesign, and private storage or backup systems. Lower-income households may already use relatively little water indoors and have fewer easy ways to reduce further without hardship. Older infrastructure in some districts may lose more water through leaks. Apartment residents and people in dense housing often use much less outdoor water than those in detached homes, yet they may still bear higher costs if rates rise. Drought in cities is therefore not only a question of total demand, it is also a question of how the burden of restraint is distributed. Uncertainty remains in how future urban systems will adapt, because each city has a different mix of climate, governance, wealth, infrastructure, and supply sources. Some Western cities have reduced per-person water use significantly over recent decades through conservation and technology. Some have expanded reuse and stormwater capture. Others remain more exposed to declining imported supplies or stressed aquifers. It remains uncertain how much long-term demand can be reduced while populations continue to grow and extreme heat becomes more frequent. What is well established is that Western cities are not separate from drought. They're expressions of it in engineered form, held stable only by large systems that themselves depend on fragile hydrologic foundations. In this part of the drought story, scarcity passes from fields into neighborhoods, from canal gates into household routines, from the visible land surface into the hidden networks beneath streets. The city remains ordered and functional, yet the terms of that order begin to shift. Lawns fade, trees are rationed, appliances become more efficient, and distant storage is watched with growing care. Urban life continues, but under a narrower water margin. Drought here is shaped by infrastructure, management, and social choice. Yet it still begins with the same physical truth that governs the basin outside the city. Less water is arriving than the region once expected, and the built environment must slowly learn to live within that reduced flow. Beneath the crops, beneath the suburban plantings, and beneath the open ground between them, drought settles into the upper layers of the earth as a problem of soil moisture. This is the water held in the spaces between mineral grains and organic matter, close enough to the surface to support plant roots, microbial life, and the first exchanges between land and atmosphere. Soil moisture is not as visible as a river or reservoir, yet it is one of the most immediate forms of water available to the landscape. When it declines, the surface of the western United States begins to change in texture, color, and function. The land stores less, plants work harder to survive, and the atmosphere above finds even less resistance to its drying pull. Soil is a mixture of mineral particles, decomposed organic material, air, water, and living organisms. The size of its particles matters. Sandy soils have larger spaces between grains and tend to drain quickly. Clay-rich soils have much smaller spaces and can hold water tightly, sometimes too tightly for plants to use easily. Loam, a balanced mix of sand, silt, and clay, often retains water in a form more accessible to roots. Organic matter improves this storage by acting like a sponge and by helping soil form stable aggregates, which are small clusters of particles that create a more favorable structure. Under drought, these differences become important because they determine how long soil can hold water after rain or irrigation, and how quickly that water becomes unavailable. The uppermost soil layers respond first to weather. A few hot, windy days can dry the surface rapidly, especially when vegetation cover is sparse. The ground may then form a pale crust or a hardened skin that changes how later water enters. If rain arrives on a crusted surface, some of it may run off rather than soak in. This loss reduces infiltration, the process by which water moves from the surface into the soil in healthy, moist ground. Infiltration can replenish shallow storage and support later plant use. In dry, compacted ground, the opportunity is partly lost, and the land becomes less able to capture the moisture it receives. Soil moisture is often described through zones. The shallowest zone changes quickly with weather and sunlight. Below it lies the root zone, where many grasses, crops, shrubs, and trees take up most of their water. Deeper still, some water may continue downward toward groundwater, though that depends on soil type, geology, and how much moisture is available in the first place. Drought affects all these layers. But the root zone is especially important because it links hydrology directly to biology. When the root zone dries, plants begin to experience water stress even if deeper moisture remains below their reach. In the western United States, repeated hot seasons and reduced snowmelt recharge often leave this root zone depleted for long periods. The drying of soil alters more than plant access to water. It changes the energy balance of the land surface. Moist soil uses a portion of incoming solar energy to evaporate water. Dry soil cannot do this as effectively. More of the sunlight is then converted into sensible heat, meaning heat that raises the temperature of the air and ground directly. This makes the surface warmer, which in turn encourages even more drying. The result is a feedback loop. Dry soil leads to greater heating, and greater heating leads to further soil moisture loss. Scientific observations and land surface models indicate that this land-atmosphere feedback is an important part of how drought intensifies during hot periods. Cracking is one of the clearer physical signs of severe drying in certain soils, especially those rich in clay. As water leaves the soil, the material shrinks. Surface cracks open, sometimes deep enough to change the path of later rainfall or irrigation. Water may rush into the cracks and bypass the upper root zone, or it may be lost more quickly to evaporation from newly exposed surfaces. In other soils, the sign is not cracking but looseness and dust. Fine particles detach more easily, and the land becomes vulnerable to wind erosion. In both cases, the structure of the surface grows less favourable to storing and using water efficiently. Biological activity in the soil also changes under drought. Microbes, fungi, and small invertebrates help decompose organic matter, cycle nutrients, and maintain soil structure. Their activity depends strongly on moisture and temperature. When the soil becomes too dry, many of these processes slow. Nutrients may become less available to plants, even when they remain present in the ground. The partnership between roots and soil organisms weakens. This is especially important in rangelands and natural dry lands, where long-term ecosystem function depends on the slow turnover of organic matter and the stability of the soil surface. Drought therefore reduces not only immediate water availability, but also the underlying biological capacity of land to recover and remain productive. A dry soil profile stores less of each future storm. After a long drought, the first precipitation may not produce the same benefits it would have brought to a moist landscape. Very dry soils can initially repel water in some cases, especially where fire or certain organic compounds create water-repellent surfaces. Even where repulsion is not strong, the first moisture may simply refill the driest upper layers and fail to move deeper. This means that early relief from rainfall can appear limited. Plants may green slightly, and the surface may darken, yet the deeper storage needed for lasting resilience remains incomplete. Recovery of soil moisture is often slower and more uneven than the arrival of rain alone might suggest. The role of vegetation cover is central here. Plants shade the soil, reduce direct heating, and help maintain structure through their roots. Litter from leaves and stems can protect the surface from raindrop impact and slow evaporation. When drought thins plant cover, the soil loses these protections. Bare ground warms faster, dries faster, and sheds more water during intense storms. This creates another feedback. Dry soil reduces vegetation, and reduced vegetation exposes the soil to further drying. Across the western United States, this feedback appears in cropland, rangeland, shrubland, and forest openings, though the details vary with each ecosystem. Measurements of soil moisture come from direct probes in the ground, remote sensing from satellites, and models that combine weather, land cover, and soil properties. These methods show broad deficits across drought-affected western regions, especially during prolonged hot spells and low snow years. It remains uncertain exactly how each local soil system will respond, because soil properties vary sharply over short distances, and because vegetation and land use alter the pattern. Some valleys may retain moisture better due to finer soils or irrigation return flows. Some slopes may dry extremely quickly because they are shallow, rocky, or sparsely covered. Even so, the broad pattern is clear. Drought in the western United States involves a persistent reduction in soil water storage across large areas, and this reduction amplifies surface heat and ecological stress. In the inward structure of the drought story, dryland soils represent a deeper form of scarcity than empty channels or declining reservoirs. These upper earth layers are the immediate living store beneath the land surface, the place where water becomes available to roots, microbes, and the exchange of heat between ground and air. When that store shrinks, the landscape loses one of its most important buffers. Rain becomes less effective, heat becomes more intense, and plants depend on a reserve that is no longer there in sufficient measure. The drought has now entered the ground itself, settling into the pores of the soil, reducing its quiet capacity to hold and moderate the life above it. Above the drying soils of the western United States, the living cover of the land begins to show the next inward layer of drought. Forests, woodlands, shrublands, and grasslands all depend on water stored in snow, soil, and shallow ground. When those stores decline, the response appears in leaves, needles, stems, roots, and the overall condition of plant communities. This response is not always sudden. Vegetation can endure short dry periods by slowing growth, shedding leaves, or drawing on deeper moisture. Yet when warmth remains high and the land stays dry across seasons or years, the strain accumulates. The result is a thinning of a living cover, a weakening of ecological resilience, and an increased exposure to disturbance, especially fire. Plants lose water through transpiration, the movement of water from roots to leaves and then to the atmosphere through tiny pores called stomata. This loss is necessary because it is tied to photosynthesis. When stomata open, carbon dioxide enters the leaf, allowing the plant to build sugars from light, water, and air. Under drought, plants begin to close these pores to conserve water. This helps delay dehydration, but it also slows growth. The plant becomes more cautious with its exchange with the atmosphere. Over time, reduced photosynthesis means less energy for new tissue, less repair of stress damage, and less capacity to defend against insects and disease. Different kinds of vegetation respond in different ways. Grasses often react quickly to a lack of moisture. They may cure early, meaning they dry out and turn from active green tissue into dry standing fuel. Shrubs can survive longer through deeper roots and slower growth. But prolonged drought can thin their leaves, reduce flowering, and kill branches. Trees often show the slowest visible response because they store resources and can draw on moisture from deeper soil layers. Yet this apparent stability can be deceptive. A tree under long drought may continue to stand green for a time, while its internal water balance becomes increasingly strained. When that strain crosses a threshold, needles brown, branches die back, and mortality may spread through stands that once appeared stable. Forests in the West are especially sensitive to the combination of heat and drought. Snowpack decline reduces spring and early summer moisture. Warm air raises evaporative demand. Dry soils limit root uptake. Trees must then maintain water columns within their stems under stronger tension. This tension is the pull required to lift water upward from roots to leaves. If it becomes too strong, the water column can break through a process called cavitation, in which air bubbles form and block the transport tissues. Once enough of these pathways are blocked, the tree can no longer move sufficient water to support its canopy. In severe cases, this hydraulic failure leads to death. The process is well documented in drought-stressed forests, though the exact threshold varies by species and local conditions. Insects and disease often exploit this weakened state. Bark beetles, for example, are native components of many western forests, but drought can shift the balance in their favour. Healthy trees produce resin and other defences that help resist infestation. When drought reduces a tree's ability to maintain those defences, beetles can establish more successfully and spread through stressed stands. Warmer temperatures may also support faster insect development or broader survival in some regions. The result is not a separate problem from drought, but a biological consequence of drought stress acting through weakened plant defences and altered climate conditions. Grasslands and rangelands reveal a related but somewhat different pattern. These open ecosystems depend heavily on seasonal soil moisture. When winter and spring are dry, grass production declines. The land may support fewer annual plants, lower forage growth, and more bare ground between clumps of vegetation. In heavily grazed areas, drought can magnify the stress because plants have less opportunity to recover leaf area and root reserves. Shrublands may become patchier, with gaps widening between living plants. These gaps expose more soil to sun and wind, further increasing surface dryness and erosion risk. The living cover becomes less continuous, and the landscape stores less moisture and organic matter than before. Fire risk rises as this biological drying spreads. Fire itself is a natural process in many Western ecosystems, but drought changes the timing, frequency, and intensity of burning conditions. Fine fuels such as grasses and dry leaves ignite readily when moisture content falls. Shrubs and trees under water stress may contain less moisture in their living tissues than they would in wetter years. Dead branches and accumulated litter become more combustible. Heat and low humidity then make it easier for ignitions to spread. The drought does not create every fire, since ignition also depends on lightning or human activity, but it prepares the fuel bed in ways that support faster and larger fire growth. The relationship between drought and fire is not identical everywhere. Some forests that have become denser through past fire suppression can burn severely under drought because there is abundant fuel and limited moisture. Some grasslands respond quickly to wet years by growing more fine fuel, then become especially flammable when that growth cures in a later dry period. Some high-elevation forests may still burn less often because temperatures remain lower and fuels remain patchy. It remains uncertain exactly how each ecosystem will shift under future combinations of drought, heat, and management. Even so, the broad understanding is strong. Drought increases vegetation stress and often creates conditions more favorable for destructive wildfire. Vegetation change also feeds back into water balance. Healthy plant cover shades soil, slows runoff, improves infiltration, and contributes organic matter that helps the ground retain moisture. When cover thins, these functions weaken. After severe fire, the effect can become even more pronounced. Burned slopes may repel water temporarily, shed sediment into streams, and lose the slow moderating influence once provided by roots and canopy. A drought-stressed and burned watershed therefore often yields water in a flashier, less reliable pattern, with reduced ecological stability and greater erosion. The damage then extends beyond the plants themselves into the function of the whole landscape. Satellite observations help reveal these changes over broad areas. Greenness indices, canopy temperature, and measurements of burned area show where vegetation is active, where it is stressed, and where fire has altered the surface. Ground studies add detail by measuring tree growth rings, leaf water potential, mortality rates, and forage production. Together, these records indicate that many Western ecosystems are already responding to hotter drought conditions with reduced growth, greater mortality, and shifts in species composition. In some places, forests may fail to regenerate after high-severity fire, especially if the post-fire climate is too warm and dry for seedlings to establish. This possibility remains uncertain in its exact extent, but observations indicate that it is a real concern in several Western regions. In this part of the drought story, the land cover is no longer only a passive recipient of water shortage. It becomes an active participant in how the drought deepens. Stressed vegetation uses less water in some moments because it closes its pores and slows growth, yet it also provides less cooling, less shade, less soil protection, and less resilience against fire and erosion. The forest canopy grows thinner, the range produces less forage. The living surface that once buffered heat and held the ground in a more stable state begins to weaken. Drought has now entered the biological skin of the landscape, altering how the land breathes, grows, and burns under the pressure of persistent dryness. Beneath the rivers, beneath the reservoirs, beneath the irrigated soils and drying vegetation, another body of water lies in the pores and fractures of rock and sediment. This is groundwater, the water stored below the surface in aquifers. An aquifer is a layer of permeable material, such as sand, gravel, or fractured rock, that can store and transmit water. In the western United States, groundwater serves as the slower hidden reserve of the drought system. It is less visible than snowpack and less immediate than streamflow, yet it often sustains farms, towns, and ecosystems when surface supplies diminish. During prolonged drought, this hidden reserve carries a greater burden. Wells are pumped harder, shallow water tables fall, springs weaken, and the land's long timescale of storage begins to thin. Groundwater forms when water from rain, snowmelt, rivers, canals, or irrigated fields infiltrates the ground and moves downward through the unsaturated zone, the part of the subsurface that still contains both air and water. Once it reaches the saturated zone, where the pore spaces are filled with water, it becomes part of groundwater storage. The top of this saturated zone is called the water table. In some places it lies close to the surface, supporting wetlands, stream base flow, and riparian vegetation. In other places it lies far below, accessible mainly through deep wells. The depth and character of groundwater vary widely across the West, but in all cases recharge is usually slower than the visible movement of surface water. What enters the ground may take years, decades, or longer to accumulate meaningfully. This slow pace makes groundwater both valuable and vulnerable. It is valuable because it buffers dry periods. When rivers run low and reservoir deliveries are reduced, wells can continue to produce water from past recharge. This allows agriculture to keep fields in production, cities to supplement imported surface supplies, and rural communities to maintain drinking water even when streams diminish. Yet the same delay that makes groundwater useful also makes it difficult to restore quickly. Water withdrawn from an aquifer during a severe drought may represent recharge from many earlier seasons. If pumping exceeds recharge over long periods, the reserve declines. Recovery then depends not on a single wet storm or a single snowy winter, but on sustained replenishment over time. Aquifers differ in how they hold and release water. In coarse sediments such as sand and gravel, water can move relatively easily through the connected pore spaces. In fine sediments such as clay, water may be stored but released only slowly. In fractured rock, the key pathways are the cracks and openings created by geologic stress or dissolution. Some aquifers are confined beneath less permeable layers, which place the groundwater under pressure. Others are unconfined and respond more directly to changes in recharge and pumping. These differences matter because drought does not affect all groundwater systems in the same way. Some wells remain stable through several dry years. Others decline quickly when pumping intensifies or when nearby streams no longer provide recharge. The connection between groundwater and surface water is especially important. Many streams in the western United States receive part of their flow from groundwater discharge. This is the deeper support beneath base flow, the slow contribution that keeps channels running between storms and after snowmelt declines. When water tables fall, this support weakens. Springs may discharge less water, wetlands may contract, and stream reaches that once flowed steadily may become intermittent. The change can be gradual and therefore hard to notice at first. A channel that still flows in spring may go dry earlier in late summer. A spring-fed meadow may shrink around its edges. A cottonwood stand along a creek may show stress because the roots can no longer reach the falling moisture below. Pumping increases during drought because groundwater often appears to be the remaining reliable source. Farmers deepen wells or run pumps longer to replace reduced surface deliveries. Municipal systems increase well production when imported water becomes uncertain. Households in rural areas depend entirely on private wells that may be shallow and sensitive to a falling water table. In the short term, this pumping can sustain livelihoods and reduce immediate hardship. In the long term, intensive pumping can push aquifers into decline, especially in closed basins or dry valleys where natural recharge is limited. The hidden reserve then becomes not a stable refuge, but another diminishing part of the drought system. As groundwater levels decline, the cost of access rises. Water must be lifted farther to the surface, which requires more energy. Shallow wells may fail first, not because the aquifer is empty in a regional sense, but because the local water table has dropped below the depth that the well can reach. This creates uneven exposure. Large users may afford deeper wells and stronger pumps, while smaller farms and households face interruptions sooner. Drought in the groundwater layer therefore has a social dimension as well as a hydrologic one, because the ability to endure falling water levels is not evenly distributed. In some aquifer systems, prolonged groundwater decline causes the land surface itself to sink through a process called subsidence. This happens when water is removed from fine-grained sediments and the grains compact under the weight above them. Once compressed, these sediments may lose part of their storage capacity permanently. The surface lowering can damage canals, roads, and other infrastructure, and it changes how water moves across the land. Subsidence is one of the clearer signs that groundwater drought is not merely invisible depletion below ground. It can reshape the surface and reduce the future usefulness of the aquifer itself. Groundwater quality can also worsen during decline. As water tables fall, the remaining water may become more concentrated in dissolved salts or minerals. In some places, deeper pumping can draw in older water with less favourable chemistry. Reduced flow through wetlands and streams can change temperature and habitat conditions. These quality changes may not appear everywhere, and their details depend on local geology and land use. But they show that groundwater shortage is not only about quantity. The character of the remaining water can shift as the reserve is stressed. Recharge remains one of the great uncertainties in Western groundwater systems. observations indicate that some wet years and managed recharge efforts can return significant water to certain aquifers, especially where floodwater or excess river flow can be spread over permeable ground. In other areas, recharge is naturally slow, spatially uneven, or strongly limited by geology. It remains uncertain how much future precipitation, snowmelt, a management effort will be able to rebuild aquifers already drawn down by long-term pumping. Warmer conditions may also reduce recharge efficiency by increasing evaporation and plant uptake before water reaches the saturated zone. This means that not every wet period restores the hidden reserve in proportion to the water that falls from the sky. Scientific understanding across the western United States shows that groundwater has become an increasingly important drought buffer, and that this growing role carries risk when surface water remains weak for too long. Satellite measurements of gravity, well records, stream observations, and local studies all indicate that major western basins have experienced groundwater loss during extended drought periods. The exact rate and depth of decline vary from place to place. Some aquifers still hold large reserves. Some communities are beginning to manage pumping more carefully. Even so, the broader pattern is clear. The hidden water below the surface is being asked to compensate for shortages above the surface, and in many places it cannot do so indefinitely. In the inward movement of the drought story, the aquifer is the deep reserve that reveals how long the system has been under strain. Surface water responds seasonally, soil moisture responds weekly, vegetation responds across months and years, groundwater responds on the longest human timescale in ordinary view, carrying the memory of many past seasons within it. When this reserve begins to decline, the drought has reached a deeper layer of the land than most daily observation can see. Wells continue to pull water upward, but the margin beneath them narrows, springs weaken, base flow recedes, and the quiet stored weight of the subsurface grows lighter. The drought has entered the hidden water beneath the west, where recovery is slow and every withdrawal reaches forward into years not yet lived. At the deepest processed layer of the western drought threat, the separate parts of the story gather into one water balance. A water balance is the accounting of how much water enters a system, how much is stored, how much leaves, and how these terms change through time. In the western United States, this balance once depended on a relatively familiar sequence. Cool season storms delivered rain and snow. Mountain snowpack stored part of that water in frozen form. Spring melt released it gradually into streams and rivers. Reservoirs held some of the flow for later use. Soils, vegetation, and aquifers absorbed part of the supply and returned part of it slowly. Human systems then diverted, stored, transported, and used water within the limits that the basin seemed able to support. That sequence still exists, but its internal proportions have shifted. The present drought threat is the result of those shifting proportions acting together. The first change is in input. In some years, the western United States receives less precipitation across key mountain watersheds than the 20th century average that shaped many current expectations. In other years, total precipitation may not be dramatically low, yet the form and timing of that input change. More winter moisture falls as rain rather than snow, especially at lower and middle elevations. This reduces the amount of water stored for later release. The mountains still receive weather, but the efficiency with which weather becomes durable seasonal storage declines. A storm that once strengthened the long summer water supply may now produce a shorter pulse that passes through the system too early. The second change lies in atmospheric demand. Warmer air increases evaporative demand across soils, vegetation, rivers, and reservoirs. This means the atmosphere removes a larger share of available moisture unless replenishment keeps pace. Importantly, this higher drying power can intensify drought even in years when precipitation is not extremely low. The system loses more water between storms, during warm spring periods, across exposed reservoir surfaces, and from irrigated land. The atmosphere does not wait for absolute absence of rain before it begins to deepen shortage. It works continuously on the supply that already exists, reducing the fraction of that supply that remains stored or available for later use. The third change is in runoff efficiency. This term describes how much of the water entering a basin as precipitation eventually becomes stream flow. In a cooler system with healthier snow storage and lower evaporative demand, a larger share of moisture can move into rivers. In a warmer system, a greater share is lost first to evaporation, plant uptake, soil recharge deficits, and other processes that do not immediately contribute to stream flow. Scientific studies of the Colorado River Basin and related western watersheds indicate that warming has reduced runoff efficiency, meaning that each unit of precipitation now tends to yield less river flow than it would under cooler conditions. This is one of the central mechanisms by which climate warming deepens drought without requiring a uniform collapse of precipitation. Storage also changes across the entire system. Snowpack storage declines in reliability. Reservoir storage is drawn down more often and recovers less completely in some periods. Soil moisture storage weakens under repeated heat and dryness. Vegetation stores less water in living tissues and provides less buffering through shade and transpiration when stressed. Groundwater becomes a larger source of compensation, but that compensation draws down aquifers that refill only slowly. The system thus loses not just water in one place, but layered forms of storage in many places at once. Each storage layer can partially support the others for a time, yet when several are weakened together, resilience declines sharply. Human demand enters this balance as another persistent term. Water use in the West supports cities, farms, industry, ecosystems, and energy systems. Some uses can be reduced through conservation, pricing, improved technology, and revised cropping patterns. Some reductions have already been substantial in several urban areas, yet overall demand remains large, and some of it is inflexible in the short term. Permanent crops need water to survive. Cities require reliable supply for health and sanitation. Hydropower depends on adequate reservoir levels. Ecological systems need minimum flows and groundwater support that are often not fully protected in highly allocated basins. When natural supply declines and storage weakens, demand does not vanish. It presses against the reduced system and reveals how narrow the remaining margin has become. This is why the worst present drought threat in the United States can be understood as a compound drought centered in the western snow-fed water system. It is not only a rainfall deficit. It is not only heat. It is not only overuse. It is the interaction of reduced or less effective precipitation, warmer air, earlier melt, lower runoff efficiency, declining surface storage, stressed ecosystems, and rising dependence on groundwater. Each factor alone would matter, acting together. They produce a deeper and more persistent imbalance than any single metric can fully describe. The Colorado River Basin illustrates this compound process with particular clarity, but the underlying mechanism extends beyond that basin into other western watersheds. Snow-fed river systems in California, the Great Basin, the interior Rockies, and parts of the Pacific Northwest all depend on the timing and storage of cool season moisture. Wherever warming shifts snow toward rain, accelerates melt, dries soils, and reduces runoff efficiency, the same inner drought logic appears. Local details differ. Some basins are more reservoir dependent, some more groundwater dependent, some more vulnerable to forest loss or agricultural withdrawal, yet the shared process remains the same. The water balance is being tilted by heat in a direction that makes every stored form of water less secure. It remains uncertain how this balance will evolve in every future decade because weather variability remains strong. A sequence of wet years can temporarily rebuild snowpack, recharge reservoirs, and ease water restrictions. Managed aquifer recharge and conservation can improve resilience. Operational changes in reservoir management and interstate agreements can reduce some vulnerability. These possibilities are real and important. At the same time, observations and modelling indicate that continued warming will keep raising evaporative demand and will continue to challenge snow storage in many western mountains. It remains uncertain exactly where thresholds of abrupt system change may lie, such as long-term loss of forest cover in certain watersheds or chronic failure of shallow wells in specific communities. What is known is that the direction of pressure on the water balance is clear. The deeper significance of this drought threat is that it alters timing, not only amount. Water arrives at less useful moments, remains stored for shorter periods, and is asked to satisfy demand across longer hot seasons. A river may still flow after winter. A reservoir may still hold immense volume. An aquifer may still yield water from depth. Yet each of these forms carries less assurance than before because the whole system around them has become less favourable to retention. The drought is therefore not merely an event imposed upon the West from outside. It is a reorganisation of how the region stores and moves water from sky to snow, from snow to stream, from stream to reservoir, from soil to plant, and from aquifer to well. At this innermost layer, the many visible signs of drought resolve into one governing pattern. The atmosphere asks for more moisture. The mountains store less of it as snow. The land releases it earlier. Rivers receive a smaller share. Reservoirs lose more to heat and continued delivery. Soils and ecosystems retain less resilience. Groundwater is drawn upon more heavily because the shallower stores are weaker. Human use continues within systems designed for a fuller river. None of these processes is completely new. What is new is their combined intensity under a warmer climate and a heavily committed water system. The result is a drought threat that reaches from the broad sky down into the deepest hidden reserves, binding every layer into a single narrowing balance. The western landscape settles into its dry balance without haste. Mountains remain in place above the basins. Rivers continue their courses through stone, though with less certainty than before. Reservoirs hold what they can. Fields wait for delivery. Cities measure, conserve, and endure. Beneath all of this, the soil keeps only a limited store. Vegetation leans into restraint, and aquifers release water accumulated across longer spans of time. Nothing in the scene appears sudden when viewed at rest. The danger lies in persistence, in the steady narrowing of margin across every layer of the system. The drought threat of the present is not defined by one empty channel or one season of low snow. It is defined by the way warmth, timing, storage, and demand now meet each other in less favourable proportions. Winter moisture arrives less reliably as lasting snow. Spring release comes earlier. Summer heat asks more from land and water. Rivers carry a smaller share of what falls. Reservoirs and aquifers are used to bridge a gap that does not fully close. The region continues to function. But more of that function depends on careful management of a supply that has become harder to renew. There is still movement everywhere. Thin snow turns to melt. Melt becomes streamflow. Streamflow enters storage, soil, roots, pipes, canals, and wells. Some years offer relief. Some watersheds recover part of what was lost. Yet the deeper pattern remains one of caution. The West is learning that drought is no longer only an interval between wet periods. It is becoming a governing condition of how water is stored, moved, and valued. Evening comes softly over the ridges and reservoirs. The land holds its shape in the fading light. Dry grasses stand still. Dark water rests below pale shorelines. Far beneath the surface, hidden reserves remain quiet in stone and sediment. The whole system endures in measured tension, waiting on cold storms, careful choices, and time.